By spring, you will birth our son. The mountain man's words cut through the biting wind, a strange and impossible promise. He spoke to the girl shivering in the snow, a girl thrown from a freight wagon like a sack of unwanted grain. Anyone else would have left her for the wolves, but not him. He'd lifted her from her frozen grave, built a fire with knowing hands, and now he was claiming the child in her belly, a child that wasn't his. She didn't know his name. She didn't trust his face, a rugged map of white and native blood. But he spoke with a calm certainty that sent a different kind of chill down her spine. He acted as if this baby, the secret shame she carried, was a prayer he'd been waiting for. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand yet, was that this unborn child carried a legal claim. A claim to land richer than any gold strike. A claim that powerful men in silk vests and polished boots would kill to see buried under the snow. Forever. Now, as the first signs of a thaw creep down the mountain and the first real pains of labor tighten her belly, she has to face the truth. The man who saved her has a plan, and the man who shamed her has a shovel, ready to bury them both. When spring finally breaks, will she bring a new life into this world, or will the mountain become her silent tomb? The wagon wheels groaned to a stop, the sound like breaking bones in the deep, muffling snow. The jolt tore Clementine Bell from a restless sleep. She pushed aside the thin wool shawl, her breath misting in the frigid air. Through blurry, exhausted eyes, she saw nothing but a world of white. Fat, heavy snowflakes swirled from an iron-gray sky, relentlessly erasing the rough mountain trail they'd just carved. This was nowhere. "End of the line for you, girl." The voice came from the driver's seat, sharp and cruel. The traitor, a man named Silas, didn't even turn to look at her. His weathered face was a mask of cold indifference. "Your ma paid me to get you near the old trapper shack, not to play nursemaid through a blizzard." "Please," Clementine whispered. Her voice was a fragile thing, easily swallowed by the wind. She cradled her swollen belly, a protective instinct that had become second nature. "The storm. It's getting worse. Can't we just wait it out?" Silas finally turned, his eyes like chips of flint. "Ain't my problem." He grabbed her small leather satchel, the one containing everything she owned in the world, and tossed it over the side. It landed with a soft thud in a fresh drift. "Out you go. Got paying deliveries to make before dark." Clementine's legs felt like water as she climbed down from the wagon bed. The icy wind wasn't just cold, it was a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving needles into her skin. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, when her mother had shoved a cold biscuit and a few coins into her hand, before ordering her onto this wagon, her face a mask of grim duty. No tears, no goodbyes. Just removal. "But where is the shack?" Clementine asked, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "I don't see anything. I don't see anything at all." The sharp crack of Silas's whip was her only answer. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels churning, spraying her with a wave of slush and snow. It disappeared into the swirling white, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly alone. She tried to take a step, to follow, to scream, but her legs refused to obey. They simply gave way. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the endless, suffocating white of the snow rushing up to meet her. She didn't see the figure watching from the rocky ridge high above. A man who had seen the whole thing, a man who now understood this wasn't just an abandonment, it was an execution. Jonas Graybear moved down the ridge with the swift, sure-footed grace of a man born to the mountains. His snowshoes left barely a whisper on the fresh powder. He'd been tracking the wagon for the better part of an hour, his curiosity piqued. No sane person would brave this pass with a storm like this rolling in. Not unless they had a reason more powerful than common sense. Now he knew the reason. Someone had paid to have this girl disappear. As he drew closer, he saw how still she was. A dark bundle in a world of white, like a fallen bird with a broken wing. Her dark hair had come loose, a stark black splash against the snow. There was no hesitation in his movements. He knelt, slid his strong arms beneath her, and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight. Even through her soaked clothes, he could feel the deathly chill of her skin. Her face was as pale as milk, her lips tinged with blue. But she was breathing. Shallow, ragged little puffs of mist in the frigid air. She was alive. For now. The line shack wasn't far. He'd built it himself years ago, tucking it into a protective cradle of bluffs that broke the worst of the mountain gales. He carried her there now, his moccasined feet finding the path by memory alone, a path already vanishing under the storm's relentless assault. He moved not with hurry but with a deep, unshakable purpose. As if he wasn't just carrying a stranger, he was carrying a destiny. Inside the shack, the air was still and cold, but it was a refuge from the howling wind. Jonas laid her gently on his narrow cot, her head resting on a pillow stuffed with dried pine needles. He worked with an efficiency that was almost silent. He built up the fire in the stone hearth, his hands knowing just how to stack the dry pine to catch and roar to life. Flames leaped high, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He heated water in his biggest pot, the one he used for rendering bear fat, and found his cleanest wool blankets in a storage chest. As the small space began to fill with a life-giving warmth, a faint touch of color returned to Clementine's cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly, heavily, opened. She stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams for a long moment, confusion clouding her eyes. Then her head turned, and she saw him. Fear. It was instant and sharp, a wild animal's terror. She took in his appearance in a single panicked glance. The mix of blood in his features, the hard lines of his face, the gray-streaked black hair worn in two long braids. His clothes were buckskin, adorned with intricate Lakota beadwork that seemed alien and threatening. She tried to scramble back on the cot, to pull away, but she was too weak. Jonas had seen that look 100 times before. The fear of the unknown, the fear of what wasn't like you. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He poured some of the hot water into a tin cup, adding a pinch of dried shredded bark from a leather pouch. "Drink," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble like stones moving at the bottom of a river. "It's willow bark tea. It'll help with the chill." Clementine pushed herself up, one arm automatically curving around her middle. She accepted the cup, her hands trembling so badly the hot liquid sloshed over the rim. She didn't drink. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with a single desperate question. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Jonas settled onto a low wooden stool near the fire. The flames lit one side of his face, leaving the other in deep shadow. He studied her, not with pity, but with a strange, unnerving intensity. He saw the sorrow etched around her eyes, the weariness that went bone deep. She reminded him of a doe he'd once found, caught in a hunter's snare, terrified but with a spark of fight still left. He let the silence stretch, letting the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside be the only answer. Then finally he spoke the words that would change everything, the words that made no sense. "By spring," he said, his voice gentle but firm as bedrock, "you will birth our son." And then he added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "And I will be here to welcome him." Clementine's eyes widened in disbelief, the fear momentarily replaced by sheer, staggering confusion. Her hand clutched the rough wool blanket, pulling it tighter around her shoulders as if it could shield her from his madness. But the baby isn't yours," she stammered, the words tumbling out. "You don't even know me. We've never met." Jonas simply nodded, his weathered face as serene and unreadable as the mountain peaks outside. It was a terrifying calm. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just agreed with her. "The Creator sent me to protect you both," he stated, not as a belief, but as a fact. He gestured to the untouched cup of tea in her trembling hands. "Drink now. Rest. You're safe here." Clementine took a tentative sip of the bitter tea. It was warm, and the warmth spread through her chest, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Tears welled, hot and sharp, but she blinked them back, refusing to show any more weakness in front of this strange, quiet man. "My mother," she began, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "She told me there was a trapper, a man who needed a housekeeper. She said, she said he'd take me in, even with, she broke off, her gaze falling to her swollen belly, the source of all her trouble. I am that trapper, Jonas said quietly, though I never sent word to any town seeking help. He rose from his stool, his tall frame momentarily blocking the firelight, and added another log to the flames. Sparks flew up the chimney like angry fireflies. Your mother was wrong to abandon you to the storm, but perhaps the Creator guided her hand even in her cruelty. She brought you exactly where you were meant to be. A sob, thick and painful, caught in Clementine's throat. How can you say that? How can any of this be meant to be? You don't know what I've done. You don't know the shame I've brought on myself. I know what I see, Jonas interrupted. His tone was still gentle, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction, a force that silenced her protest. I see a child of the Creator, carrying another child of the Creator. Both are precious, both are worthy of protection. He moved to the small, frost-covered window, peering out into the swirling abyss of the storm. This will last through the night, maybe longer. Rest now. We will speak more when your strength returns. Clementine wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that she didn't deserve this kindness, that there had to be a mistake. But a profound exhaustion, deeper than any she had ever known, was pulling at her like a physical weight. The willow bark tea had loosened the knots of fear in her stomach, and the fire's heat was a heavy, lulling blanket on her eyelids. Before sleep finally dragged her under, she watched him through slitted eyes. He began to prepare a meal, his movements sure and peaceful in the flickering firelight. He moved as if he belonged here, as if he'd been waiting for her. And for the first time in nearly a year since the moment she'd realized her life was ruined, Clementine felt a flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever. She felt safe. But safe from what? The storm outside, or the storm this man carried inside him? Jonas moved with the practiced economy of a man who wastes nothing. Not a motion, not a word, not a thought. While Clementine slept a sleep so deep it was like a temporary death, he worked. He hung her wet, threadbare clothes on a line strung near the hearth, the rising heat turning them from frozen rags to merely damp ones. He added another blanket to the cot, tucking it carefully around her still form. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of shrieking wind and pounding snow. But inside the sturdy log walls, there was only the steady crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic sound of Clementine's breathing. When the broth was ready, a simple, savory brew of rabbit and wild roots he'd stored for the winter, he gently roused her. You need to eat, he said, his voice low. He helped her sit up, propping her against the rough-hewn headboard. Steam rose from the wooden bowl in his hands, and the scent filled the small cabin, a smell of earth and life that made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. Her lips were cracked, her hands still shaking too much to hold the spoon. Without a word of comment, Jonas sat on the edge of the cot beside her. He held the bowl, patiently spooning the warm liquid to her lips. Small tastes, he instructed, his voice calm and steady. Your body needs time to accept it. She managed only a few spoonfuls before turning her face away, the small effort leaving her utterly spent. But the broth had worked a small magic. A bit of color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, as they roamed the cabin's interior, seemed clearer now, less clouded by fear and exhaustion. She was seeing the space for the first time. It was a single room, crude by town standards, but meticulously kept. The thick log walls were chinked with a mixture of mud and moss, a formidable barrier against the mountain's fury. From the sturdy rafters hung the bounty of a successful season, smoked strips of deer and rabbit, braided bundles of dried herbs, and nets filled with gnarled roots. On the stone mantel above the fireplace, a collection of wooden carvings stood in silent watch. There were elegant figures of bears, eagles, and wolves, carved with a skill that was both beautiful and deeply reverent. Clementine recognized the style as native, but there was a quiet dignity to them that transcended any one culture. What struck her most was the order of the place. Everything had its purpose. The neat stack of firewood, the well-worn tools hanging on pegs, the small collection of books on a rough shelf. There was no clutter, no waste. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate life. "You carved these?" she asked, her voice still raspy. She gestured with a slight tilt of her head toward the mantel. Jonas nodded. "My mother taught me," he said simply. "Working the wood helps quiet the mind." He took the half-empty bowl from her and set it aside, then rose to add another log to the fire. "Sleep now. Tomorrow will be soon enough for talking." When Clementine awoke again, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the cabin's single window. The world outside was silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape wrapped in a blanket of pristine, untouched white. Jonas was already up, melting a large pot of snow over the fire. "For washing," he explained, seeing her questioning look. He retrieved a small, rough bar of lye soap and a clean cloth from a shelf. He also brought her one of his own wool shirts, a deep forest green, worn soft with age. "This will be warmer than your own things." He set everything within her reach, then turned his back to her completely, busying himself at the far end of the cabin, granting her a privacy she hadn't even thought to ask for. The simple, unspoken courtesy of it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes, the way he offered help without making her feel helpless. The profound respect in his averted gaze. She couldn't remember the last time anyone, especially a man, had shown her such simple human consideration. Once she was dressed in his shirt, which hung on her like a tent but was wonderfully warm, Jonas began to teach her. He didn't lecture or command. He just showed her. He demonstrated the proper way to tend the fire, his large, capable hands explaining how to stack the logs to ensure the best airflow. "Fire needs to breathe," he said, "just like all living things." They spent the morning by the hearth as he taught her how to whittle kindling from a block of pine. He placed a small, sharp knife in her hand, showing her how to hold it safely, how to feel the grain of the wood and work with it, not against it. When her attempts were clumsy and the shavings were thick and uneven, he didn't scold. He simply nodded and showed her again, his patience a deep, quiet well that seemed to have no bottom. The day passed in a rhythm of simple tasks and few words. As evening approached, another storm began to gather in the distance. The wind began to moan through the high passes again, rattling the cabin's sturdy door. By unspoken agreement, they stayed near the fire, its warmth a shield against the growing dark and the creeping cold. "Have you—" Clementine hesitated, gathering her courage. The question felt impossibly bold, but she had to ask. "Have you ever been married?" Jonas was silent for a long time, his hands continuing their steady work on a piece of wood he was shaping into a spoon. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the rising howl of the wind. "No," he answered finally, his voice low. "Never found the right time, or the right person." He set aside his carving and stared deep into the flames, his face a mask of old memories. "My mother died of the pox on the reservation. My father was killed by raiders while defending a wagon train. Happened in the same year." Clementine hugged her arms around herself, feeling the baby shift within her, a small, reassuring flutter. "Is that why you came to these mountains? To be alone?" "Came here to escape the noise," Jonas corrected gently. "The noise of men. Too much arguing over land deeds and gold claims. Too many promises broken like dry twigs." He gestured with his chin toward the window, where fresh snow was already beginning to pile up against the glass. Up here, I hear only the Creator's voice in the wind. He speaks clearer than any man's laws or treaties." Tears, hot and sudden, welled in Clementine's eyes. She stared down at her hands, resting on the swell of her belly. "I've never been good at anything," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. "My mother, she always said so. Too slow, too clumsy, too—" She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "Too much." Jonas turned to look at her then, his gaze direct and piercing in the firelight. His weathered face was grave. "You're still alive," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "You survived the cold. You survived being thrown away. That's not weakness. That's proof you're strong." Clementine blinked, startled. No one had ever called her strong. Not once in her life. She searched his face for any sign of mockery, any hint of a hidden agenda. She found none. There was only a quiet, unshakable conviction. The wind howled its wild song outside, but inside the cabin's four walls, something profound had shifted. A tiny, fragile seed of hope, long dormant, began to stir within Clementine. It wasn't because this man had promised to protect her. It was because he looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw something worthy of protection. He saw strength where she saw only failure. Here was a man who asked for no explanations, demanded no apologies. He simply offered what he had: shelter, food, knowledge, with a quiet dignity that made accepting his help feel less like charity and more like sharing in something sacred. As the night deepened, he returned to his carving, and she returned to her kindling, each small, successful curl of wood a tiny victory against a lifetime of feeling useless. The baby moved again, more active now in the quiet hour, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide it. She didn't feel ashamed. In this small, warm space, with this quiet man who spoke to God in the wind, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world for her after all. But a new, unsettling thought took root in her mind. If he truly believed the Creator sent her, what else did he believe? What did the Creator demand in return? The next 3 days passed in a gentle, healing rhythm. The fierce mountain storm slowly released its grip, the constant howl of the wind softening to a whisper. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was taking place. Jonas was a patient teacher, introducing Clementine to the vital, simple skills of mountain survival. One morning, she complained of the swelling in her ankles, a persistent discomfort of her pregnancy. Without a word, Jonas went to his stores and gathered a handful of gnarled, dried roots. "Watch careful now," he instructed, crushing the woody pieces between his calloused hands. "Too much makes the tea bitter. Too little won't help the swelling." He showed her how to measure the crushed roots against the lines in her palm, a measurement as old as the mountains themselves. "It smells like the earth after a good rain," Clementine said, inhaling the steam from the cup. Jonas nodded, a flicker of a pleased smile on his lips. Good medicine often does. Later that day, he took her just outside the cabin to teach her how to set snares for rabbits. The snow had formed a thick, icy crust, and walking was treacherous for Clementine. She moved cautiously, one hand always resting protectively on her belly. "Like this," Jonas demonstrated, his hands working the thin wire with practiced, fluid ease. "The rabbit always follows the same tracks in the deep snow. You set the snare at the height of its chest, not too tight, not too loose." Clementine's fingers, clumsy with cold and inexperience, fumbled with the wire. She dropped it twice into the snow. Each time, Jonas simply picked it up and handed it back to her without a word of impatience. There was no scolding, no sigh of frustration, just the quiet encouragement of his unwavering presence. He was teaching her more than how to catch a rabbit. He was teaching her patience with herself. In the evenings, by the crackling fire, he introduced her to soapstone carving. He placed a small, smooth piece of the stone in her hands, showing her how to feel its weight, its texture, its hidden potential. "The stone will tell you what it wants to be," he explained, demonstrating the proper way to hold the small carving knife. "Don't force it. Listen with your hands." Clementine frowned at the shapeless gray rock in her palm. "I don't think I can do this," she admitted, the old litany of her mother's criticisms echoing in her head. "I've never been good with my hands, always breaking things." Jonas set down his own work, a half-finished carving of an owl, and turned to face her fully. He held up his right hand. For the first time, Clementine saw that it was maimed. The ring finger and the little finger were missing, ending in scarred nubs at the second knuckle. "Lost these to frostbite my second winter up here," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "A bad storm, worse than the one that brought you. I thought I was going to die for sure." He flexed the damaged hand. "But I didn't. When spring came, I had to learn how to do everything again. I built this cabin, every log, every nail, with 8 fingers instead of 10. It wasn't easy. My work wasn't pretty at first. But I learned. I learned new ways to hold things, new ways to work." He picked up his carving knife again, his grip unconventional but firm. "Sometimes," he said, his eyes meeting hers, Our limitations are what teach us how to truly live. The next morning, Jonas insisted on a short walk. The day was crystal clear and breathtakingly cold, the snow-covered world glinting like it was sown with diamond dust. They made their way slowly along a trail he had packed down. Suddenly, Clementine's foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. She pitched forward with a cry of pure terror, her arms flailing. Before she could hit the ground, Jonas was there. He moved with impossible speed, his strong arms catching her, his body shielding her rounded belly from the impact. The near fall left her shaking, tears of fear and relief freezing on her cheeks. The reality of how close she had come to harming her child struck her like a physical blow. Jonas guided her to a fallen log and knelt in the snow before her. To her astonishment, he began to speak in a language she had never heard before. The words were soft, melodic, flowing from him in the crisp mountain air. It was Lakota. His eyes were closed, and he placed one hand very gently on her belly as he prayed. Though she couldn't understand the words, the deep reverence, the powerful, protective plea was unmistakable. He was praying for her child, for their child. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, Clementine found herself absently rubbing her belly. "He's moving a lot tonight," she said, the words slipping out before she could think. It was the first time she had referred to the baby as he instead of it. Jonas looked up from his bowl, a slight, knowing smile touching his lips. He said nothing, allowing her the quiet dignity of this shift in her own heart. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. The question that had been haunting her since the first night finally demanded to be asked. "Why?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you keep saying this baby is yours? Why do you believe he is our son?" Jonas set aside his wooden bowl. He was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers in the hearth. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was filled with a conviction that was absolute, a faith as solid as the mountain they lived on. "Because for 5 years, every winter, I have made the same prayer. I prayed for a family, I prayed for a son, and I prayed for a woman strong enough to carry him to me." He looked at her then, his dark eyes holding hers. "The Creator does not always answer our prayers in the ways we expect, but He always answers." Clementine stared at him, searching his face for any hint of delusion, any sign of deceit. She found none. She saw only the same steady certainty that had saved her from the storm, the same quiet strength that had taught her to carve stone with her clumsy hands. She looked down at her own belly. For the first time, she didn't see it as a mark of shame, as evidence of her foolishness and ruin. She saw it as something valuable, something precious. Jonas didn't see her as a fallen woman. He saw her as the answer to a prayer. The fire popped, sending up a shower of bright embers. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the mountain night still and sacred. Clementine picked up the piece of soapstone she'd been working on. Perhaps Jonas was right. Perhaps she just needed to learn new ways to hold things, including herself. A fragile peace settled over the mountain cabin, a quiet interlude that lasted nearly a week. The rhythm of daily survival, gathering wood, checking snares, melting snow for water, gave Clementine's days a purpose she had never known. But that tranquility shattered one afternoon, like ice under a hammer blow. Jonas returned from checking his distant trap lines, his heavy leather bag bulging with more than just furs. "Mail came through," he said, stamping the snow from his boots. "The carrier was making a rare winter run to the mining camps. I caught him on the low trail." He pulled out several folded, snow-dampened papers. "One's for you." Clementine looked up from the small animal she was carving from her soapstone, her face a mask of surprise. "For me? But no one knows I'm here." Jonas handed her the envelope. The handwriting was instantly, painfully familiar. It was from her older sister, Sarah. Clementine's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Sarah's neat, perfect script filled the page, words that brought back a flood of memories of home, making her throat tighten. But as she read, the blood drained from her face. The soapstone animal slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. "What is it?" Jonas asked, his voice sharp with concern. It's about Nathaniel Harrow, Clementine whispered, the paper crinkling in her white-knuckled grip. Her voice was thin, reedy. He's running for mayor of Silver Creek. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to read the next line aloud. And he's planning a new silver mining operation on Lakota land. Jonas's face became utterly still, his expression hardening like granite. He pulled a stool over and sat opposite her, his dark eyes boring into hers. Tell me about this Harrow, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Clementine stared into the fire, the flames blurring through a film of fresh tears. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. He's the son of the Maine mine baron, educated back east in Denver. Everyone in town, everyone thought he was courting Elizabeth Whitman, the banker's daughter. A perfect match. Her voice grew smaller, turning inward. But he noticed me too, or he pretended to. Jonas waited, his silence a patient, heavy presence in the small cabin. He would leave notes for me, she continued, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt, at the Mercantile, asking me to meet him behind the stables after dark. He said I was special, different from the other girls who just wanted his money. He said he saw a soul in me. Her voice broke on a bitter, self-mocking laugh. And I believed him. I was so stupid. I thought maybe someone finally saw past my plain face and my clumsy ways. The tears came then, hot and silent, tracking paths down her cheeks. When I told him about the baby, everything changed. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before in his life, as if I were a stranger accusing him of some terrible crime. The next day, his engagement to Elizabeth Whitman was officially announced in the town paper. 2 days after that, she whispered, the memory still raw, my mother called me into the parlor. She had a stack of banknotes on the table. More money than I had ever seen. She said Mr. Harrow had been very generous, that he had solved the problem. She had arranged for the traitor, Silas, to take me away, to make me disappear. It was for the best, she said, for the family's reputation. The fire popped and hissed into the suffocating silence that followed. A muscle worked in Jonas's jaw, the only sign of the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, controlled. The land, he said, standing and moving to a large wooden trunk in the corner. The land that Harrow wants. He lifted the heavy lid. It's not his to take. He returned with a worn leather folder and spread its contents on the table. There were old yellowed maps and documents filled with formal legal language. There's a treaty, he said, his finger tracing a line of text. The Henderson Red Cloud Agreement. It's an old one, mostly forgotten by the white authorities. It recognizes the rights of descendants of mixed lineage, those with blood from both worlds, as legal stewards of the land. Clementine looked from the papers to his face, her mind struggling to grasp the meaning. What does that mean? Jonas's finger tapped a specific clause in the treaty. It means, he said, looking up to meet her eyes, his gaze intense, that if your child, Harrow's biological son, and my adopted one, is born healthy, and his name is recorded in the territorial register, he can file a claim. A legal claim to both the water and mineral rights on that land. He let the words sink in. It's a claim strong enough to block that mine. Permanently. Understanding crashed over Clementine with the force of a physical blow. Her hand flew to her belly. That's why you knew, Jonas nodded grimly. When I found you in the snow, it was not by chance. I had already sent letters to Reverend Matthews down at the agency post. We had been corresponding for months about the treaty. I knew Harrow was making moves, trying to acquire the land through his father's company. I was preparing a legal fight. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it held no humor. The Creator works in strange ways. I was praying for a son. Harrow was trying to get rid of his. It seems our prayers got tangled up. But why didn't you tell me any of this before? Clementine asked, her head spinning. You needed to trust first, Jonas replied simply. You needed to trust me. But more than that, you needed to trust yourself. You needed to believe that you and this child have value. Not because of a piece of paper, not because of mining rights, but because every life is sacred. The claim is just a tool. The real fight is for your son's dignity. The weight of it all was immense. Her baby, the child she had been taught to see as a burden, a mark of her own sin, was now the key to protecting this land, this way of life that Jonas held so sacred. This quiet mountain man hadn't just saved her from a snowstorm. He had been preparing for this war long before she ever arrived on his mountain. He had seen her not as a victim, but as an ally. As evening crept in, Jonas went to the corner where he kept his tools. He took up his hatchet and a whetstone. The steady, rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filled the cabin, a sound of preparation, of sharpening a blade for a coming battle. Clementine watched him, one hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked, a strong, insistent movement, as if he could feel the gravity of the moment, as if he knew he was at the center of the storm. She thought of Nathaniel Harrow in his fine suits, making speeches about progress while plotting to tear the heart out of this mountain. Then she looked at Jonas, his face illuminated by the firelight, his hands steady and sure. He was a man who understood that true progress wasn't about what you could take from the earth, but what you could protect. The blade of the hatchet gleamed as he tested its edge with his thumb. The sound of the whetstone resumed, steady and sure, a promise being made to the falling snow, a promise of a fight to come. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows through the frost-covered windows. Jonas had the old maps and treaty documents spread across the wooden table, his weathered hands sorting and resorting them with methodical precision. "I need to ride to the agency, clerk," he announced, his voice firm. He began folding the papers carefully into a protective oilskin pouch. "It's a 10-mile ride east, 2 days' journey, maybe 3 in this weather." Clementine's hand, which had been absently tracing the lines of her soapstone carving, stilled. 3 days. The thought of being alone in this vast wilderness sent a spike of fear through her. Jonas nodded, pulling on his heavy winter coat. "I need a witness signature on the birthright petition. Can't file the treaty claim without it." He moved to the woodpile, stacking an extra supply of logs near the hearth. "Keep the fire strong. Bank the embers at night so the coals last till morning." He went through a checklist of instructions, his voice calm and reassuring, but the urgency beneath it was clear. He checked the heavy wooden bar on the door. "Use this. Don't open it for anyone. Not for any reason." He paused, his dark eyes studying her face. "You'll be safe here. The storms have passed, and no one travels these high trails in winter without a very good reason." But they both knew one man now had a very good reason to come looking for her. Before he left, Jonas retrieved his spare revolver from the storage trunk. He showed her how to check if it was loaded. The weapon felt unnaturally heavy and cold in her hands. "Just having it close gives a person courage," he said quietly. She stood in the doorway, a small, lonely figure against the vast white landscape, as Jonas mounted his sturdy paint horse. She watched until the horse and rider were just a dark speck against the snow, and then they were gone. The silence that descended on the cabin was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight. Back inside, she barred the door and added a log to the fire. The cabin, which had felt like a cozy sanctuary with Jonas in it, now seemed vast and empty. Every creak of the logs settling, every gust of wind whistling through the chinks, made her heart leap into her throat. To keep her mind from spinning into panic, she found the small, leather-bound journal Jonas had given her. He'd meant for her to practice her letters, but instead she found herself pouring out her fears onto the blank pages. Words about Nathaniel's cruel betrayal, her mother's cold rejection, the heavy burden of shame she had carried for so long. But as she wrote, other words came too. Words about Jonas's unexpected kindness, the quiet strength she was discovering in herself, and the fierce, protective love she felt for her unborn child. As afternoon light began to fade, she took a stick of charcoal from the hearth and began to sketch in the journal's margins. Crude, simple shapes at first. What she imagined her baby's tiny hands would look like, the soft curve of a sleeping cheek. The images were filled with a love so powerful it felt like an ache in her chest. That evening, searching for extra kindling, she stumbled upon a wooden box tucked away in Jonas's storage trunk. Inside were scraps of fabric, pieces of worn-out shirts, squares cut from old blankets, even remnants from trading post grain sacks. An idea sparked. Her mother, before everything had gone so terribly wrong, had taught her the basics of quilting. The skills, long dormant, returned to her now. By the flickering light of a tallow lamp, she began to piece the disparate scraps together, her needle flying. The work absorbed her completely, a meditation that pushed the fear into the background and stitched the lonely hours together. The first night alone was the hardest. Every sound from the dark forest outside was a potential threat. But the fire burned steady, the door remained barred, and the heavy revolver lay on the table beside her bed. By the second day, she had found a new rhythm, a solitary routine of survival and creation. When Jonas finally returned, his face was chapped and raw from the wind, his clothes stiff with ice. Clementine rushed to help him out of his frozen gear, her heart pounding with a relief so intense it almost felt like pain. "The clerk signed," he said, his voice raspy. He pulled the precious papers from inside his coat, where he'd kept them protected against his body heat. "And Reverend Matthews agreed to keep a notarized copy safe until the spring thaw. He's a good man. He understands what's at stake." She fed him hot broth laced with honey while he thawed by the fire. Did, did anyone ask about me?" she asked, her voice small. Jonas shook his head. "Town's quiet. Too cold for gossip." He didn't tell her about the suspicious looks he'd gotten at the agency post, a half Lakota man filing unusual papers about land rights and an unborn child. Some battles were best fought in silence. After he had eaten and rested, Clementine retrieved something from beneath her cot. "I made this," she said softly, "while you were gone, to say thank you." She held out a small carved wooden rattle. It was simple, shaped like a bird, but the wood was sanded smooth, and it was clear she had poured hours of care into its creation. Jonas took it, turning it over and over in his large hands. He felt the weight of it, the weight of what it truly represented. Not just gratitude, but trust, a partnership. Without a word, he stood and crossed to the mantel. He placed the rattle next to his most sacred possession, his mother's beaded medicine pouch. The two objects, one from his past, one from his present, sat side by side in the firelight. "My mother would have liked you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "She believed in seeing the strength in people long before they could see it in themselves." Clementine blinked back tears, her heart swelling at the simple, profound acceptance in his words. She returned to her quilting as Jonas prepared for bed, the familiar, comforting sounds of his evening routine filling the cabin once more. They were safe. They were prepared. But neither of them saw the lone figure on horseback watching the cabin from the deep shadows of the tree line. The rider sat motionless, a dark silhouette against the snow, observing the single point of warm, lamplit life in the vast, frozen darkness. After a long moment, he turned his horse and spurred it back toward town. He had the information he'd been sent for. Nathaniel Harrow now knew exactly where to find them. The wooden rattle on the mantel cast a long shadow, a silent testament to how far Clementine had come. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating, building something new and beautiful from cast-off pieces. Much like Jonas had built a life for himself in these mountains. Much like they were now, together, building a future for their son. But as the winter days counted down toward a spring that promised both birth and battle, a storm far more dangerous than any blizzard was gathering on the horizon. 2 weeks passed, but winter's grip held fast. Fresh snow fell almost daily, piling in deep, silent drifts against the cabin walls. One afternoon, as Clementine sat by the window, adding another square to her now nearly finished quilt, the muffled crunch of hooves in snow broke the profound silence. Jonas was at the window in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that rested on pegs above the door. Through the swirling flakes, a single rider emerged from the trees, hunched low against the biting wind. "Mail rider," Jonas said, a note of suspicion in his voice. "He's off his usual route." He opened the door a crack as the man dismounted, a small avalanche of snow falling from the shoulders of his heavy coat. "Much obliged," the rider said, his voice raspy from the cold, as he stomped his boots on the porch. "Name's Hank Elroy. Got turned around in this squall. Mind if I warm up a spell before I push on?" Jonas hesitated, his eyes scanning the man's windburned face. The man's story was plausible, but something felt wrong. Still, mountain hospitality was a sacred code. He stepped aside, though his body remained tense, a silent barrier between the stranger and Clementine. "Come in, then." Elroy's gaze swept the cabin, quick and sharp, taking in every detail. It lingered on Clementine, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by something uglier. A sly smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well now, if it ain't little Clementine Bell, heard tell you'd run off." His eyes dropped pointedly to her swollen belly, his smirk widening into a sneer. "Though I reckon I can guess where you run off to. Surprised Harrow's letting you keep his bastard." The word bastard hung in the warm air like a foul smoke. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice dangerously level. "You're welcome to the warmth of my fire, Mr. Elroy. You're not welcome to my business." Clementine's fingers clutched the fabric of her quilt, her knuckles turning white. She knew Hank Elroy. He was one of the loafers who was always hanging around the town saloon, a man whose favorite pastime was trading in cruel gossip. Jonas put a pot of coffee on to boil, deliberately keeping his body positioned between Elroy and Clementine. The mail rider shed his coat and made himself comfortable by the fire, as if he owned the place, his eyes constantly moving, cataloging everything. The native carvings, the neat stack of legal-looking papers on the table, the new hand-carved rattle on the mantel. "Mighty domestic setup you got here," Elroy commented, his tone thick with insinuation, as he accepted a cup of coffee. "Wouldn't have figured it from a half-breed mountain man." Jonas ignored the slur. They ate a tense, silent meal of beans and cornbread. When Elroy was finished, he reached for his coat with an exaggerated, clumsy movement. A folded piece of paper slipped from his inside pocket and fluttered to the floor near the hearth. "Oops," he said, making no move to pick it up. "Clumsy me." Clementine's heart stopped. From across the room, she recognized the elegant, looping script on the exposed corner of the letter. It was Nathaniel Harrow's handwriting. Jonas bent and picked up the letter. His face remained a stony mask as he handed it back to Elroy. But not before his sharp eyes and Clementine's glimpsed a few key phrases. Land filing complication, and a chillingly cryptic reference to resolving the girl problem before spring. "Much obliged for the hospitality," Elroy said, tucking the letter away with a look that was pure venom. He knew they had seen it. That was the entire point of his visit. It was a message, a threat. After showing the man to the small barn for the night, Jonas returned and barred the cabin door. He checked the fastenings on the single window. Clementine hadn't moved from her chair. "He planned that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Dropping the letter. Harrow sent him. He sent him to find me and to warn us." Jonas nodded grimly, his face etched with worry. "More than that, he was sent to confirm you were here, and to see who was with you." He went to a high shelf and took down a rusted tobacco tin. He began gathering their most important papers, the treaty documents, the birthright petition, the notarized copy from the Reverend. "We need to hide these, somewhere they won't be found." Together, moving as a silent team, they pried up a loose floorboard near the back wall, a spot hidden beneath a stack of firewood. Jonas placed the tin in the dark, hollow space beneath, then carefully replaced the board, scattering dirt over the seam to conceal it. "Try to sleep," he told her, his voice gentle despite the tension that crackled in the air. "I'll keep watch." But sleep, when it finally came for Clementine, was a place of nightmares. She dreamt she was standing at the edge of a vast open pit, one of Harrow's silver mines. Black, oily sludge bubbled up from its depths, reaching for her with grasping, tar-like fingers. She tried to run, but her pregnant body was slow and heavy. The sludge caught her ankles, cold and suffocating, pulling her down into the suffocating dark. She woke with a choked cry, her nightdress soaked in sweat. Jonas was there in an instant, his strong hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "He's hunting me," she sobbed, clutching the front of his shirt. "He's going to find us. He'll take my baby. He'll either use him to get the land or he'll make sure he's never born at all." "Shh," Jonas soothed, pulling her into a protective embrace. His own heart ached at the raw terror in her voice. "He won't get you," he vowed, his voice a low, fierce rumble against her hair. "He won't get either of you. I swear it on my mother's grave." When the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, they found the barn empty. Elroy was gone. He had slipped away before sunrise, leaving only his horse's tracks in the fresh snow, tracks that led directly back toward town. The message had been delivered. The threat was now real. "What do we do?" Clementine asked, her voice small but steady. She was terrified, but the terror was being forged into something harder, something sharper. Jonas stood beside her at the window, his face set like stone. "We stop waiting for the fight to come to us," he said simply. "We get ready." He looked at the wooden rattle on the mantel, the symbol of their unlikely family. The Creator didn't bring you through that storm just to let a man like Harrow tear everything apart. Outside, the snow continued to fall, slowly, inexorably covering Elroy's tracks until they vanished completely. But they both knew. The enemy now knew where they were. The time for hiding was over. The sanctuary had become a fortress, and they would have to defend it. The morning after Elroy's visit, the cozy warmth of the cabin was replaced by the cold, metallic smell of gun oil. Jonas laid his old Colt revolver on the kitchen table, its parts spread out on a clean cloth. "Time you learned," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I've never even touched a gun before," Clementine admitted, her hands twisting in her lap. "These days, knowing how is more important than wanting to," Jonas replied grimly. He cleaned each part with a practiced efficiency, explaining its function as he worked. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to handle the weight of it. Outside, in the muffled silence of the snow-laden pines, he set up empty tin cans on a fallen log. The winter air was sharp and clean, and it bit at their faces. He stood behind her, his larger hands guiding hers, showing her the proper stance, the right way to grip the revolver. "Keep both eyes open," he instructed, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "Breathe out slow and steady, just like when you're carving the soapstone. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." The first shot was a deafening explosion that shattered the mountain's peace. The gun's kick was a brutal, shocking force that sent a jolt up her arm and made her stumble backward. Jonas steadied her, his hand firm on her elbow. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of snow 10 feet from the target. "It's so loud," she gasped, her whole body trembling. "Again," Jonas said, his voice calm and unwavering. "Fear gets smaller every time you face it." They worked all morning. Shot after shot echoed through the forest. Her hands grew sore, her ears rang, but she didn't complain. She just reloaded and tried again. Finally, one of her shots connected, grazing a can and sending it spinning off the log. A fierce, unfamiliar surge of pride bloomed in her chest. Jonas gave a single, approving nod. It was more praise than her own mother had given her in a lifetime. While she rested, Jonas retrieved a set of heavy, iron bear traps from the barn. He showed her how to set their powerful jaws safely, his hands moving with immense respect for the danger they represented. He placed them at strategic points around the cabin's perimeter, concealing them under a light dusting of fresh snow, marking each location on a rough map he sketched on a piece of hide. "These aren't meant to catch a man," he explained, his face grim. "They're meant to make him scream, an alarm bell no one can ignore." That afternoon she surprised him. "Could I ride with you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice determined. "When you check the trap lines, I need to know the paths, in case I ever have to use them alone." Jonas studied her for a long moment, seeing the new, hard resolve in her eyes. "The terrain is rough," he cautioned. "I'm stronger than I was," she stated simply. The next morning he helped her onto his steady paint horse. They rode single file through the silent, snow-draped forest. Jonas pointed out landmarks, a lightning-scarred pine, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the bend in the creek where the otters played in spring. He was giving her a map, not on paper, but in her mind. Near midday, he led her to a small, secluded clearing. At its center was a gentle rise in the earth, marked by a collection of weathered stones. Faded prayer bundles, small pouches of leather and cloth tied with feathers, swayed from the branches of a lone pine tree. It was a grave. "My mother," Jonas said quietly, his voice thick with reverence as he removed his hat. He knelt beside the mound of earth. "She taught me everything, the white man's ways and our people's sacred ways. She believed you had to walk in both worlds to have balance." He gently touched one of the stones. "She would have liked you, She admired a fighting spirit. Clementine stood back respectfully as Jonas spoke soft words in Lakota, his deep voice a prayer on the cold wind. She thought of her own mother, who had sold her for a handful of banknotes, and a tear of a different kind of grief froze on her cheek. As they returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow in hues of orange and purple. That evening, after a simple meal, they sat before the fire. Clementine watched Jonas as he began carving a new piece of wood. She recognized the shape he was forming. It was a cradle board, intricately detailed for the baby, for their son. An overwhelming wave of emotion washed over her. Everything this man had done, saving her, teaching her, preparing to defend her, now preparing for her child as if it were his own flesh and blood, it was too much to hold inside. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she reached across the small space that separated them and took his hand. Jonas looked up, his carving knife stilled. He was surprised, but he didn't pull away. His palm was rough and calloused against hers, a testament to a life of hard work. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words felt impossibly small for the enormous debt she felt she owed him. Jonas turned her hand over and brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a single gentle kiss there. "There is no debt between us," he said softly. Tears welled in her eyes. "I have never," she said, her voice thick, "been treated like I was worth fighting for. Until now." Jonas's dark eyes met hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, as they watched the fire together. It wasn't the flowery, passionate romance she'd read about in penny novels. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more real. A love built not on whispered promises in the dark, but on shared burdens, mutual respect, and the quiet dignity of seeing the true worth in another soul. The fire burned low. Their joined hands rested between them, a bridge built across two lonely worlds. In that peaceful silence, Clementine felt the baby kick, a strong and steady rhythm, as if adding his own silent blessing to the bond that had formed between his protectors. He was no longer a secret shame. He was a promise they would both die to protect. The warm Chinook winds swept down from the high peaks, a sudden, surprising gift from the mountains. The deep freeze broke. Snow began to melt in thick, muddy rivulets, and the air filled with the smell of damp earth and the promise of new life. "The weather's turning," Jonas announced, his experienced senses reading the signs. "Spring's coming early." The thaw brought a new urgency. "We'll need to leave for the agency post as soon as the low roads are clear," he said, checking the wheels of the small mule cart. "We need to file the claim before Harrow can make his move." But their plans were not their own. On the second day of the thaw, as Jonas was loading the last of their supplies, a sharp, sudden intake of breath from the cabin doorway stopped him cold. He turned to see Clementine gripping the doorframe, her face pale, her knuckles white. One hand was pressed hard against her swollen belly. "Jonas," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. I think it's starting." He was at her side in 3 long strides, his calm presence a rock in the sudden storm of her panic. He helped her back inside, to the clean blankets he had already prepared near the fire. The contractions began as gentle rolling waves. "Breathe," he encouraged, his voice a low, steady anchor, like the wind through the pines, steady and strong. As the sun arced across the sky, the gentle waves became a crushing, relentless tide. The pain was an all-consuming thing, stealing her breath, her thoughts, her courage. Jonas never left her side. He was a constant, soothing presence, supporting her back, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of encouragement in both English and Lakota. "I can't," she cried out as night fell, her body exhausted, her spirit starting to fray. "It hurts too much." "You can," Jonas insisted, his voice firm but gentle, cutting through her pain-filled haze. "You are stronger than this pain. Breathe with me. We'll do this together." The hours bled into one another. When sheer panic threatened to overwhelm her, Jonas cradled her face in his large, warm hands. "Look at me, Clementine. Look at me. Don't listen to the pain. Listen to my voice. You are not alone. I am right here. Near dawn, after a grueling 24-hour ordeal, the final moment came. One more push, Jonas urged, his hands steady, his voice a beacon. Our son is almost here. With a final monumental effort, a cry tore from Clementine's throat, and then it was answered by another. A new cry, strong and indignant, that filled the small cabin with the miraculous sound of life. Jonas caught the squirming infant, his movements sure and practiced. A boy, he announced, his voice thick with an emotion that cracked its usual stoic surface. He is strong, and he is perfect. He laid the newborn on Clementine's chest. Mother and child met for the first time. The baby's eyes, when they briefly fluttered open, were a startling, stormy shade of gray. Harrow's eyes. Isaac, Clementine whispered, the name coming to her as if from a dream. She touched her son's tiny face with a trembling finger. His name is Isaac Jonas Graybear. Tears rolled, unchecked and silent, down Jonas's weathered cheeks. He had given her child a name, a place. She had given his name, his legacy to her son. He moved to the water bucket and returned with a damp cloth. With profound reverence, he gently touched the cloth to the baby's forehead, first speaking the sacred words of his mother's people in Lakota, then seamlessly transitioning into the familiar, comforting cadence of the 23rd Psalm. Two faiths, two worlds, joined together in the blessing of this one small child. The patchwork quilt, the one Clementine had poured all her hopes and fears into, became Isaac's first blanket. Jonas wrapped him in its colorful squares, and the infant immediately calmed. Clementine watched, her exhausted face glowing as Jonas settled into his chair by the fire, cradling Isaac with the natural ease of a man who had waited his whole life for this moment. The baby's tiny hand curled around one of Jonas's fingers, and the mountain man's rugged face softened with a look of pure wonder. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the scene in a golden glow. This child, born of betrayal and shame, delivered in love and acceptance, was more than just a new life. He was a bridge. He was the promise of justice. Rest now, Jonas told her gently. We are watching over you. As Clementine finally surrendered to an exhausted sleep, the last thing she saw was Jonas pressing a feather-light kiss to Isaac's forehead, his lips moving in a silent prayer of his own. Outside, the Chinook winds continued their work, melting the last of the old snow, making way for the new beginnings of spring. This was not an ending. It was the first day of the war. 3 days after Isaac's birth, Jonas packed his leather satchel. The air in the cabin was filled with a new kind of tension. I have to go, he said, folding the precious documents, Isaac's freshly signed birth certificate and the treaty papers, into an oilskin pouch. The roads are passable now. I have to file this claim before Harrow even knows the child has been born. 4 days, 2 there, 2 back. The weather should hold. Clementine sat in the rocking chair, nursing Isaac, her face a mask of worry. What if they come while you're gone? Jonas moved with deliberate calm, a counterpoint to her fear. He stacked a week's worth of firewood inside the door. He checked his pistol, then holstered it. My rifle stays here with you, he said, propping the heavy Winchester against the wall near her chair. It's loaded. Remember what I taught you. Line up the front post with the rear notch, Clementine recited, her voice a low, steady murmur. Squeeze slow. Don't pull. Good. He paused at the door, kneeling beside her chair to gently touch Isaac's dark hair. You keep your mama safe, little warrior, he whispered. Then he looked up at Clementine, his eyes locking with hers. The Creator did not bring us this far to abandon us. He mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the vast greening landscape of the mountains. 2 days passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. On the 3rd day, miles away on the trail to town, Jonas sensed trouble before he saw it. The birds went silent. His horse's ears twitched, its gait becoming hesitant. The trail ahead wound through a narrow ravine, the rock walls rising steep and shadowed on either side. It was a perfect place for an ambush. The first shot kicked up dirt just inches from his horse's hooves. The second tore through the flesh of his shoulder, the impact spinning him clean out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the precious satchel clutched tight in his hand. Two men emerged from behind the rocks, their faces hidden by dirty bandanas. They weren't common bandits. The leather of their gun belts was too new, too expensive. Harrow's men. "Well now, ain't this a prize?" the taller one drawled, his pistol aimed at Jonas's head. "A half-breed carrying important-looking papers." Jonas didn't waste his breath. He rolled, clawing for his own pistol. But the second man was on him, a heavy boot crashing into his ribs. The fight was brutal, short, and one-sided. Jonas was strong, but he was outnumbered and already wounded. They beat him with a methodical, dispassionate cruelty. When he lay still, blood trickling from a cut on his temple, the shorter man snatched the satchel. He ripped it open, scattering the carefully prepared documents into the mud. "Looky here," he sneered, kicking through the papers. "Birth certificate, Isaac Jonas Gray Bear, and all this nonsense about treaty claims." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pages. Mr. Harrow was right to be worried about this one. The taller man struck a match. He touched the flame to the corner of the oilskin pouch. The papers caught, curling into black ash. Their mission was almost complete. "Ravine's deep," the shorter one said, nudging Jonas's motionless form with his boot. "No one will find the body till the buzzards lead 'em to it." They dragged him to the edge of the rocky gorge and, with a final, contemptuous shove, pushed him over. He tumbled like a broken doll, disappearing into the deep shadows below. Back at the cabin, 4 days had come and gone. Then 5. The worry in Clementine's chest had grown from a nagging ache into a cold, hard knot of pure fear. A knock on the door made her jump, her hand flying to the rifle. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. A young voice answered. "It's Mary Beth Watson, ma'am, from the farm down the valley. Ma sent some fresh eggs, seeing as how you've got a little one now." Clementine cracked the door. Mary Beth was a skinny girl of about 15 with a freckled, honest face. But today that face was clouded with worry. "What is it, Mary Beth?" Clementine asked. The girl twisted her apron nervously. "Heard some talk in town," she mumbled. "Two of Mr. Harrow's men. They were in the saloon, drinking and bragging. Said they'd taken care of some trapper problem up in Crow's Ravine." She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Ma said not to tell you, but it didn't seem right." The world tilted. The cabin walls seemed to swim around her. She managed to thank the girl and close the door, sliding the heavy bar into place. She sank into Jonas's chair by the cold hearth, breathing in the lingering scent of him, wood smoke and leather. "No," she whispered, clutching Isaac so tightly he began to fuss. "No, no, no." He couldn't be gone. He was too strong. He had promised. But as the day bled into a long, terrifying night, the terrible truth began to set in. She was alone. Harrow had won. His men would be coming for her next, coming for her son, coming to erase the last living piece of evidence. She laid Isaac gently in his cradle. She crossed to the wall and picked up the Winchester rifle. Its weight felt different now, not foreign, but familiar, necessary. She moved with a deliberate, cold calm. She retrieved the revolver and began to clean and oil it, just as Jonas had shown her. Click, snap. The metallic sounds were a counterpoint to the wild beating of her own heart. Jonas had taught her more than how to shoot a gun. He had taught her that she was worth defending. He had taught her how to be strong. By midnight, she had taken her position in Jonas's chair, the rifle across her lap, the revolver within easy reach. Isaac slept peacefully beside her. An owl hooted in the darkness, its call unanswered. "You were wrong about one thing, Jonas," she whispered to his ghost, her eyes fixed on the barred door. "The Creator didn't bring us this far to abandon us." A tear slid down her cheek, hot and defiant. "He brought us this far to make us fight." The night stretched ahead, long and silent. Clementine Belle Gray Bear was ready. The first rays of dawn were painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Clementine secured the last bundle onto Jonas's old pack mule. She was leaving, not running, but advancing. Isaac was asleep against her chest, tucked snugly in a sling made from her warmest shawl. She took one last look around the cabin, her sanctuary. Her eyes fell on the wooden rattle above the hearth. She touched it for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of Jonas's hands guiding hers. Time to go, little warrior, she whispered. She led the mule down the treacherous mountain trail, her steps careful and sure. Jonas had taught her how to read the path, how to listen to the mountain's warnings. By midday, she reached the agency post. A tall man in a black coat and a clerical collar emerged before she even reached the door. "Miss Bell?" he called out. "I'm Reverend Matthews. Jonas Gray Bear. He spoke of you." Inside, the Reverend confirmed her worst fears. Rumors of the attack on Jonas had already reached him, but he also gave her a sliver of hope. "He was a cautious man," the Reverend said, retrieving a leather folder from a locked drawer. "He left a notarized copy of all the documents with me, for safekeeping." He spread the papers on the table. The birth certificate, the treaty claims, the water rights. "It's all here." "Harrow is giving a big speech tomorrow," the Reverend said, his face grim. "He's officially announcing his mayoral campaign in the new mining venture. The territorial governor will be there." He looked at Clementine, at the tiny baby nestled against her. "It will be dangerous. The town is full of his supporters." Clementine touched Isaac's cheek. "Jonas believed in the law," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He believed these papers meant something. I aim to prove him right." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Then I will ride with you." Meanwhile, in town, Nathaniel Harrow paced his opulent office. "What do you mean she's coming down from the hills?" He raged at the two men who had ambushed Jonas. "I thought you handled this." "The cabin's empty, boss," the taller one mumbled. "But folks saw her on the trail. The preacher's with her. The governor will be here tomorrow." Harrow slammed his fist on his desk. "Everything has to be perfect. Find her. Stop her. I don't care how." But under the anger, a sliver of fear was visible in his eyes. He went to the window, staring at the mountains that held the body of the man he'd had killed. The thought of Jonas Graybear's broken body lying in that dark ravine made his hands tremble. And now Clementine was coming. The girl he had discarded was coming, carrying his son, the son who could destroy everything. As dusk fell, Clementine and the Reverend made camp just outside of town. They could see the lights twinkling, hear the distant whistle of a train. "We go in at first light," the Reverend said. "The governor arrives on the morning train. Harrow's speech is at 10. Clementine checked Jonas's revolver one last time before she lay down to rest. Isaac nestled in the crook of her arm. She was no longer a lost girl. She was a mother, a protector, an instrument of a justice that had been too long delayed. As sleep took her, she whispered one of Jonas's Lakota prayers into Isaac's soft hair. The meaning was universal. "Make us brave." The main street of Silver Creek was buzzing. Bunting hung from the storefronts, and a brass band played a jaunty tune. Nathaniel Harrow stood on a decorated platform, the territorial governor seated beside him, looking every bit the confident man of progress. "Friends! Citizens!" Harrow's voice boomed across the crowd. "Today marks a new chapter of prosperity for our great territory." Then, through the crowd, came the slow, steady clip-clop of a mule's hooves. A murmur rippled through the onlookers as they parted to let her through. Clementine Bell, her clothes dusty from the trail, her face weathered but set with grim determination, rode straight toward the platform. Isaac slept against her chest, wrapped in his colorful patchwork quilt. Harrow faltered, his speech dying in his throat. His face went white. Clementine didn't wait for him to recover. Her voice, clear and strong, cut through the morning air. "This child is yours, Nathaniel Harrow, and his birthright is the one thing you can't buy or bury." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The band stuttered into silence. "This is ridiculous," Harrow sputtered, finding his voice. "This woman is hysterical. Sheriff, remove her." The town sheriff started forward uncertainly, but Reverend Matthews spurred his horse to Clementine's side, holding the leather folder high. "I have documents here, Your Excellency," he called out to the governor. "Properly notarized documents proving this child's parentage. And I have treaties that grant this child, through his adoptive father's lineage, legal claim to the very land Mr. Harrow plans to mine." "Adoptive father?" Harrow sneered, his composure cracking. "You mean that half-breed trapper? The one who—" He caught himself, but it was too late. The one your men attacked? Clementine's voice rang out. The one they left for dead in a ravine? She shifted Isaac in her arms, letting the crowd see his face, his stormy gray eyes so like his biological father's. Jonas Gray Bear was more of a father to this child in 3 months than you could be in a lifetime. The governor was on his feet now, his face a thundercloud. These are serious allegations, Mr. Harrow. Lies, all lies, Harrow screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. Sheriff, arrest them. Arrest them both. The sheriff hesitated, looking from Harrow's unhinged rage to Clementine's unwavering calm. The crowd was muttering, their loyalties shifting. The whole scene was balanced on a knife's edge. Stop! The single word, spoken with quiet authority, cut through the tension. The crowd turned. A figure was emerging from the edge of the square, moving with a painful, limping gait. It was Jonas. His buckskin jacket was torn and bloodied. His face was a landscape of bruises and cuts. But his eyes burned with an unquenchable fire. A horrified whisper went through the crowd as they parted before him. My God, Reverend Matthews breathed. Clementine's hands trembled on the reins, tears blurring her vision. Jonas. He limped into the center of the square, the damning evidence of his survival plain for all to see. On his forearm, seared into his flesh, was a crude brand, the H logo of the Harrow Mining Company. These men, Jonas said, his voice carrying across the now silent square, and he pointed a shaking finger at the 2 thugs trying to slip away through the crowd. They ambushed me. They burned the papers. They beat me and branded me like cattle, and they left me for dead. Harrow looked like he was about to collapse. I don't know these men. But the Creator was not finished with me yet, Jonas continued, his voice growing stronger. A hunting party from my mother's people found me. They tended my wounds. They helped me get back here, to protect what is mine. He finally reached Clementine's side, reaching up to touch Isaac's tiny hand. The governor stared, his face grim at Harrow. Mr. Harrow, he said, his voice cold as steel, I believe your campaign is over. We need to have a serious discussion about treaty violations and attempted murder. The sheriff, his face set, moved past Harrow and clapped irons on the 2 thugs. Jonas helped Clementine down from the mule. She fell into his arms, burying her face in his torn jacket. Isaac held safely between them. I thought, she sobbed, we thought you were gone. Hush now, Jonas murmured, his arms a circle of strength around them. He looked down at the son he had prayed for, and the woman he had found. Our son needed both his parents to stand for his birthright. The crowd watched, silent and humbled, as justice, hard-won and undeniable, finally dawned on Silver Creek. The spring sun warmed the courthouse steps where Judge Harrison delivered his final ruling. Nathaniel Harrow was removed from the ballot and faced a full territorial investigation. All mining claims on the treaty-protected lands were declared null and void. The territorial clerk, his voice ringing with official finality, recorded the birthright of Isaac Jonas Gray Bear, guaranteeing his claim forever. But the story didn't end there. In recognition of their courage, the governor offered Jonas and Clementine a land grant, 40 acres of rich bottomland near Crystal Creek, a place to build a home. The town, shamed into a reckoning, began to change. Reverend Wallace opened his church doors to native and settler families alike. The school teacher, Miss Woodbury, started a new school where children from both worlds would learn side by side. The walls of prejudice, built over generations, had begun to crack. Weeks later, on the sacred ridge where Jonas's mother was buried, 2 communities gathered. Settler families spread blankets on the grass, while members of Jonas's mother's tribe sat in family groups. A tribal elder and Reverend Wallace offered blessings, one in Lakota, one in English. The words were different, but the spirit of hope was the same. The late afternoon sun now cast long, peaceful shadows across the newly planted fields of the Gray Bear farm. On the porch of a sturdy new farmhouse, Clementine sat in a hand-carved rocking chair, humming a lullaby to a thriving 3-month-old Isaac. Jonas came and sat beside her, his arm resting on the back of her chair. They watched as their son, their miracle, reached his chubby hands for the wooden rattle she had carved so long ago. I prayed for a son and a woman of strength, Jonas said softly, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude that was deeper than any river. the Lord gave me a nation. Clementine leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. The scars were still there, on his arm and in their memories, but they were not signs of defeat. They were proof of what they had survived. Their future stretched before them, as wide and open as the Colorado sky. Here was their victory, not in the ruin of an enemy, but in the simple, breathtaking grace of a family in a community made whole. Thank you for being part of this story. These tales of courage and justice are why we gather here. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up for what's right even when it's hard, then make sure you subscribe. I share a new one every day, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.